This week, DJI released some new firmware for the O3 system that not only included some new features such as 30 frames a second mode, 120 frames a second modes, and 10-bit, but they also included some bug fixes, including improving the RF behaviour of the remote control system when used with the DJI FPV Remote version 2. A few weeks ago, I released a video showing you that the FPV remote's behaviour in signal loss was far from ideal, and it would actually lose signal on the remote at the same point as losing signal on the goggles, preventing you from doing things such as punching out or triggering your own failsafe. DJI though say that they have improved this, and today we're going to test it. In this video I'm going to walk you through the results of my testing on the new O3 system with this new firmware. We're going to look at how the remote controller now performs, but we're also going to take a closer look at the overall RF behaviour of the O3 system on the spectrum analyzer. I'm going to show you it in manual mode, in auto mode, both 5 gigs and 2.4, and hopefully by the end you'll have a far better understanding of how the O3 system actually performs on the 5 and 2.4 gigahertz bands. Further to that, we're also going to cover the subject of antenna choice with regards to the O3 system and its dual band capabilities, and hopefully give you a better understanding of not only the RF behaviour of O3, but the whole situation with antenna choice as well. Anyway, let's get on with it. Let's take a closer look at what actually changed in the firmware first of all, and then we'll move on to the testing. Okay, so DJI have released new firmware version 01.02.0000 for the O3 system, which is for the air unit, the goggles, and the remote controller. There is lots of new stuff in this firmware which I'm not going to cover in this video, such as the new 4K 30 modes, 2.7K 30 and 1080p, as well as the 4K 120, 2.7K 120 and 1080p 120 frames a second modes as well. There's a time for the air unit change to enter low power mode after disarming, and a whole number of other things. However, the real interesting one we're going to cover today is optimize the remote controller signal in some scenarios. Now, this is in response to a video that I put out before talking about the behavior on the O3 system, that in the event of you losing signal on the goggles, you also lost signal on the remote controller as well, preventing you triggering your own fail-safe actions, and it was potentially a very undesirable behavior compared to what we've been used to on other FPV remote systems. So the first thing we're going to do is test the new behavior of the remote control system with the new firmware and see what it actually does now in the event of signal loss on the goggles, and see how the remote controller reacts. Okay, now just to demonstrate what's exactly going on after the new update. On the left-hand side of the screen, you've got the Betaflight signal input from the flight controller. This is actually showing the input from the DJI FPV Remote version 2 from the air unit. And then on the right, you've got the spectrum analysis view showing what the signal is doing on the air unit itself. The reason I've got this here is this actually shows us the transition from being in signal to out of signal, because the carrier actually changes as we do that. What I did was force the sticks into the corners for the gimbal, and there you can see the drone is spinning round, and this is showing us the inputs, and I've kept it in the same position, allowing us to see if there is a change. So for instance, if the signal drops, it will fall into the fail-safe positions. What I then did was go wandering with the remote and goggles together until the point of the signal starts to drop on the goggles, which is there. You can see that the carrier has got smaller, showing the signal has dropped, and there the carrier has dropped again to the much lower level, and this is the point of actual signal loss on the goggles. At this point, the remote control signal remained intact. However, the goggles signal did not. The way I was able to do this was actually block the signal to the goggles at distance, but not block the signal to the remote. And what this now demonstrates is that the remote controller will continue to control the drone without interruption in the event of signal loss on the goggles. Now, just to demonstrate that bit in slow motion again, you can see at the point of the carriers changing, there is no change on the input to the remote controller. You can see that it remains exactly the same as it was before, and the video link changing happens independently of the remote controller. Now, I spent a bit of time today, Saturday, doing the testing on this, and whilst it is pretty much like that every time, I have spotted the odd quirk with the remote controller does seem to pause for a second now and then when changing carriers. Here you will see a demonstration of that. It isn't something that is happening all the time, and it is a very fast pause as well, but it is something that I observed. But what I can't say though, it isn't a situation where the actual remote signal dropped as well. What I think it actually is when the remote signal changes from 5 gigs to 2.4 gigs and there's a very brief blip in the system. Now, there are a few things you need to be aware of. Number one, you do need to do this update on all parts of the system. That is the DJI Goggles 2, the DJI O3 Air unit, and the DJI FPV Remote version 2. You must do it on all parts for this new update to kick in and this new RC link behavior to work. Secondly, there are questions on if this update also fixes the problem on the DJI FPV Air unit or the Caddx Vista. I'm pleased to say that it does. It is now the same on all of the O3 Air units, i.e. O3 Vista Air unit with the new firmware. Now, just to confirm a few other little things on this goggle to remote behavior, because I have seen some posts around this. You do need to be aware that you cannot separate the goggles and remote to test this. The remote and goggles communicate between themselves and the Air unit. If you're going to test this for yourself, you have to keep these two within a very short range. If you were to put this down and walk off with the goggles, when the goggles lose link, it will also kill the remote controller because these two will lose communication as well. The signal loss behavior should always be when your remote's in your hand, the goggles are expected to be on your head, and how the system performs at the point of your goggles losing signal, but your remote controller's signal still in theory being strong. Remember, your video signal is a high bandwidth OFDM carrier. At best, the O3 system can drop it down to about 10 megahertz, but the remote signal should easily be stronger than that in most situations. Furthermore, if the remote signal has then dropped to 2.4, it's the case that it should definitely be stronger, and as a result of that, the remote signal should be able to outperform the goggles signal, or the signal I should say, from the Air unit to the goggles, and as such your remote control link should stay, but you do need to take into account that these two do need to be quite close together. Now, the next thing I just want to cover has been a bit of a controversial subject, and that is antenna choice when using O3, and specifically really the choice some manufacturers such as iFlight have made. Now, this is a complicated subject, but what I want to do is start with the very basics. The DJI O3 system is capable of dual band. So, the O3 Air unit can transmit video on 5.8 gigahertz only, but it can receive signals on both 2.4 and 5.8 gigs. Those signals are the telemetry data from the goggles, the telemetry and remote control signal from the RC. When using the O3 system with the goggles and the remote and the Air unit, it will use both 2.4 and 5.8 gigs for the goggles and the remote signals. However, when you are using the O3 system with your own RC control link, so you might be using Crossfire like I've got here, or you might be using Express LRS, and you only have the goggles and the O3 Air unit, the system will only use 5 gigahertz. The only time I have observed it entering 2.4 gigahertz is when the DJI FPV Remote version 2 is in the mix. Now, again, just to be clear, the O3 Air unit can only transmit on 5 gigs. This 2.4 gigs element is for the goggles telemetry and the RC control signals. Now, I have done a massive amount of testing on this over the last few weeks and months, and I've also tested the new firmware today, and I can confirm that still, at this point, the goggles and RC can choose to use the 2.4 gigs band if they want to. Predominantly, when you fire the O3 system up, it will usually choose 5 gigs for the whole system. It will put the video carrier on one frequency, and then the telemetry and control will hop around the band around the video carrier. If, though, there were other FPV systems that came online, such as the Avatar system, and the band became congested, the O3 system would then shift the signals from the goggles and the remote onto 2.4 gigs to free up that space on the band so it doesn't get interference. I can observe this behavior on the bench, and I've seen it on the spectrum analyzer many times, and I'll actually show you this in a minute. Okay, now to demonstrate this, what you've got here is the O3 system powered on. What we have is the goggles, the remote, and the O3 ear unit. This large video carrier here is the O3 video carrier. It's currently in 50 megabits mode, roughly a 40 megahertz carrier, currently coming out at 36, but about 40 megahertz wide in total. Then these small carriers you can see next to it here are the telemetry and RC control link carriers from the goggles and the remote. For instance, if I bring the remote in closer to the spectrum analyzer input, you'll see the remote carriers increase in height over the goggles ones there. And now if I move the remote away and bring in the goggles a little bit closer, you will then see those carriers increase compared to the remote controller ones next to it. What you can see, though, is that the O3 system predominantly keeps the video on one carrier and then the RC and telemetry on another carrier, taking up space on the band somewhere from about 5.730 up to 5.850. Now, it will pretty much stay like this until something else happens on the band and you introduce another system. And what I'm going to do now is introduce a carrier from the Avatar system. So what I'm going to do is change the channel that Avatar is currently on. I'm going to bring that right into the mix there. And then you can see that the remote and the goggles have actually moved out of the way of that carrier to the side. The O3 system is completely dynamic in the sense of it will move itself around as it sees fit and also adjust the size of the carrier as it sees fit as well. So for instance, you can now see over here, the O3 carrier is actually reduced in size down to 20 megs as a result of there being additional items on the band. If I take the Avatar system back off the screen again, out of the way, you can see the system has readjusted itself back to the full-size carrier and moved the RC carriers around. If I then bring Avatar to there, you can see that it's reduced in size again. If I now try to place it over the top of the telemetry carriers, you can see that they've moved out of the way again, and O3 has moved down to the bottom of the band, and it's actually now tried to put the telemetry and video carriers on the same frequency to try and save some space. But again, we can keep playing a game of whack-a-mole with this, moving it onto the same frequency and the system moving around. Now, you'd have noticed at this point that it hasn't actually changed to 2.4 gigs. The reason for that is because the Avatar system isn't actually causing enough of a problem on the band, because I've got the DJI Goggles 2 and the remote still quite close to the ear unit. Now, if I reposition everything so that Avatar should now cause a much bigger problem, including increasing the bandwidth and power it on, we should then hopefully start to see the effect and hopefully try and get it to kick into 2.4 gigs mode. Now, this is something I have done a number of times on the bench, but as I've already said several times, it can very much be a game of whack-a-mole. There are times where it will switch over very easily, and there are times where it won't. You can see there, just to the side of the screen, the carrier's kicked in. I'm just going to turn off max hold again so we can see things a little bit easier. And what we're going to do is now move the Avatar carrier up. I've now got it in 50 megs mode, which means it's going to take up much more space on the band. Put it right there, over the top of the other carriers. And what you can now see, that O3 has reduced its carrier size and it's moved the telemetry carriers to the side. The only problem with 50 megabits mode on Avatar is it doesn't give you a lot of options with regards to channels. You only have 4 channels that you can put things on. But what I can do is just keep moving it around until we force it to decide, you know what, I'm probably going to be better moving everything onto the 2.4 gigs mode and just leaving video alone on the 5 gigs. And there we have it. It took a bit of moving around, but there you saw the carriers change. I will just put that back on screen now so you can see that bit again. You can see that the carriers actually shifted. And what's there happened is the FPV remote and goggles have shifted over to 2.4 gigs. Now, if I just change the frequency live on the analyzer, so we're going to go down to 2.4. There you can see the carriers. Ignore this big pulsing one here. That's actually my Wi-Fi carrier in the workshop. It's the tall little ones jumping around like you've seen earlier. For instance, let me just grab the remote controller. If I now bring that remote up closer to the spectrum analyzer, you can see those signals increasing in height dramatically. That is now the remote signals on the 2.4 gigs band. If I just hop back to the 5 gigs band and take a look at everything we've got up here, what I will now do is actually shut down the avatar system, because hopefully it won't cause the FPV system to jump back, clean the band up, and then show you what is actually left on the 5 gigs band now that it has shifted to 2.4. What you're seeing is these pulse carriers here, which are the same ones we always get. They are from the ear unit, not the remote controller. And then there are some very minor carriers that are from the remote. I'm going to bring the remote in closer so you can see them. There we go. You can now see them. Very fast, but very limited pulses on the 5 gig bands, even though the remote is on 2.4. And there, as the band is cleared up, it has now switched back to 5 gigs mode because it now feels it's safe to do so. There has been some questions over, is it just telemetry that is moving over to 2.4 gigs, or is it telemetry and controlling? And it is my opinion, having looked at all the spectrum analysis, that when the goggles and remote switch over to 2.4 gigs, it is including the RC control signal. When the system is on 2.4 gigs, it does still transmit some carriers on 5 gigs, but they are very slow pulsing carriers. They are not fast enough, in my opinion, to be any form of RC control link for the aircraft. They're more than likely just link maintaining carriers or some form of communication, but they are certainly not fast enough to be carrying your RC inputs that you would see over to control your drone. Now, I have shared the spectrum analysis footage with a couple of other people as well who are involved in making RC control links. I'm not going to name their names, but I can promise you these are people who know what they're doing, and they also, like me, believe that is the case. What you're seeing move over to the 2.4 gigs band is the RC and the goggles telemetry link, and those other carriers that are left on the 5 gigs band are just some form of link maintaining carriers. This then begs the question of what antennas you should be using on your quad if you're using the DJI FPV Remote 2. Because remember, if you're not using this and you're using Crossfire Express RS, it is only going to use 5 gigs anyways. Now, in theory, to get the best possible performance, you should be using dual band antennas. For instance, the antenna that DJI ship with the O3 ear unit is a dual band antenna. I have confirmed that on my VNA. It is not one input at 2.4 and one input at 5 gigs. There are 2 independent antennas in this that are both dual band, capable of operating on both bands. However, that isn't to say manufacturers shipping their quads with just 5 gigs antennas like some of the iFlights do and other manufacturers is going to cause a problem. The chances are it may have an effect on RC signal, but what effect that is, we don't know. And in the grand scheme of things, the chances are it's going to be fairly minimal overall. There is no question, for the best possible performance, you would want dual band antennas on the quad side. But there are not that many dual band antennas out there. I believe Hugo at TrueRC is going to be making some in the future, but a dual band antenna is compromised as well. This antenna is not perfect, I'll be honest. Based on the VNA results, it's not particularly good at all. And actually, you're going to get the best video signal by using single 5 gigs antennas. Yes, you might be compromising the RC signal a little bit, but it isn't going to be dramatic overall. I don't believe for 1 minute the choice of using just 5 gigs antennas has had any effect on some of the behavior or performance issues people have seen. And for me, the problems that people have had when they've had RC link issues have more than likely been around the fact of DJI's poor behavior that they had in the earlier firmware, and that now has been dramatically improved. Now, there is one last little quirk to this that I want to mention before finishing up on this, and that is this system, whilst it's in dual band with the remote controller, it is only in dual band when in auto. If you switch this onto manual channels mode, it will actually force it to stay on 5 gigs. It will only switch into 2.4 gigs when in the auto channel modes, but putting it in manual will force it onto 5 gigs. And actually, putting it in manual does change the system behavior as well, in the sense of, whereas I said before, the way it works is it puts the video carrier on one frequency on 5 gigs and then the telemetry and control link on separate space on the band. What it then does when it's in manual is it closes all of that up and puts the telemetry and control link and the video all on the same frequency, using less space on the band, meaning if you're flying around other users and you're using the DJI FPV remote, you want to put it into manual mode. That way it will actually take up less space on the band. Especially if you're flying around other users when they don't have this remote, or you don't have this remote, you definitely want to put it in manual, because then it will shift the telemetry from the goggles onto the same frequency as the quad as well, and it should make it a little bit better working around other systems. In the end, the reality on this is, yes, I believe this remote can transmit on 2.4 and 5 gigs, but we don't believe that there's any massive effect as a result of using 5 gig only antennas on the quad with regards to it being able to receive the RC signals. There is a whole host of other things I could go on to on this, that the fact that 5 gigs antennas can sort of be used for 2.4 gigs in certain scenarios due to wavelength and all of that nonsense. But to keep it simple, I don't believe it's a major issue, and you certainly don't need to be harassing manufacturers on it. And that is pretty much it. Now, as I've shown, there is some interesting behavior on O3, but overall, the new remote control behavior is a lot better than it was before. And I'm really now in the position of being able to say that you should consider using the DJI remote, whereas in the past, I was more than happy to say you really shouldn't. Now, that is pretty much it from me on this one. If you have found the video useful, please do consider checking out the links to Patreon in the description, as well as buy me a coffee. I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who does support the channel. We would not be able to keep doing this without your support. And if you're interested in finding out more, please do consider checking them out. Furthermore, if you have any questions, anything you want to know, please do put it in the comment section and I will try and answer it as soon as I possibly can. Anyway, that's it from me. Stay safe. I'll speak to you soon.